Good evening. Welcome back to Whispered History. Tonight we begin a long journey through one of the most remarkable stories in North American history, a story of mountains and deserts, of families, clans, sheep, corn, songs, ceremonies, war, exile, survival, and home. This is the long history of the Navajo people, known in their own language as the Diné, meaning the people. Their homeland, Diné Bikea, stretches across parts of what are now Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. It is a landscape of enormous mesas, deep canyons, high mountains, dry plains, and sacred places. But this story cannot begin with a European explorer writing a name into a document. It must begin much earlier. And even then, we have to understand that there are different ways of remembering the distant past. For the Diné, history is not simply a list of dates. It is carried through oral traditions, family relationships, clan histories, language, ceremonies, and connections to the land. Traditional Diné accounts describe the people's emergence and movement through different worlds before arriving in the homeland surrounded by 4 sacred mountains. Those mountains became more than geographical landmarks. They helped define a homeland. To the east stood Cisnagini, commonly identified with Blanca Peak. To the south was Tsujiu, associated with Mount Taylor. To the west stood Duco Uzweed, the San Francisco Peaks. And to the north was Dibe Nitsa, associated with Mount Hesperus. Within and around these sacred boundaries developed a society deeply connected to the landscape. Modern archaeology and historical research tell another part of the story. Scholars have studied linguistic relationships, archaeological evidence, migration patterns, and interactions between the Diné and other peoples of the Southwest. There is still debate about exactly when and how the ancestors of today's Diné arrived in the Southwest. Some archaeological interpretations have emphasized the movement of Athapascan-speaking peoples into the region centuries ago. Diné oral traditions describe much deeper connections to the Southwest. These perspectives do not always fit neatly into a single timeline, and that is important to remember. The distant past is not always a puzzle with one simple answer. What is clear is that by the time Europeans began recording information about the Southwest, the Diné were already an established people of the region. They lived among a much older and incredibly diverse world of indigenous communities. Pueblo peoples had built farming communities across the Southwest for centuries. Their villages, fields, trade routes, and ceremonies were part of a complex regional network. The Diné interacted with these neighboring communities. There was trade, there was intermarriage, there was conflict, and there was cultural exchange. The Southwest was never an empty wilderness waiting for Europeans to arrive. It was already a homeland filled with peoples who understood its rivers, mountains, plants, animals, seasons, and climate. For the Diné, survival depended upon knowing the land. The desert could be harsh, rainfall could be unpredictable, winter could be bitter, but the landscape also provided enormous possibilities. There were places where corn could grow. There were forests on higher mountains. There were wild plants to gather. There were animals to hunt. There were springs and streams, and gradually, agriculture and herding would become increasingly important to Diné life. But before the arrival of European livestock, before Spanish horses crossed the Southwest, before sheep became central to the Diné economy, there was already a way of life built around movement, agriculture, hunting, gathering, family, and community. Small settlements could be established near fields. Families could move when conditions required it. People knew where water could be found. They knew which plants appeared during particular seasons. They knew where animals traveled. Knowledge was survival. And knowledge was passed from one generation to another. A child did not simply grow up learning how to live. A child grew up learning how to belong. Family and clan relationships were fundamental. The clan system helped establish identity and relationships between people. A person's clan connections could tell others where they came from and how they were related. These relationships carried responsibilities. They helped shape marriage customs, they helped connect distant communities, and they provided a social structure that could survive even when circumstances changed. This would become extremely important in later centuries, because the Diné would experience some of the most dramatic disruptions in their history. But long before armies arrived, long before treaties were signed, the foundation was already there: language, family, land, memory, and a sense of belonging. The Diné also developed a profound relationship with balance and harmony. The concept, often translated as Hoju, is associated with beauty, harmony, balance, and living in a good or proper way. It is difficult to reduce such a concept to a single English word. It was not simply an abstract idea. It could influence how people understood their relationship with one another, with the natural world, and with the spiritual world. Ceremonies, songs, prayers, stories, and teachings helped restore balance when life became disturbed. The world was understood as interconnected. The land was not simply property, it was part of existence. Mountains were not merely mountains, they carried meaning. The sky was not simply empty space. The sun, moon, wind, water, plants, animals, and people were part of a larger order. And this worldview would become one of the great sources of Diné resilience, because history would test that resilience again and again. But for now, let us remain in the earlier centuries. Imagine the Southwest before the arrival of Spanish soldiers. No American flag, no railroads, no highways, no modern cities, only vast stretches of high desert and mountain country. A family moves across the landscape. A child watches sheep. A farmer checks the condition of a field. An elder tells stories. Smoke rises gently from a dwelling. In the distance, the mountains stand beneath an enormous sky. Life is not easy, but it is familiar. The seasons provide a rhythm. Spring brings planting. Summer brings growth. Autumn brings harvest. Winter brings cold and preparation. People adapt. They move. They trade. They negotiate. They defend themselves. They raise children. And they remember. Then, slowly, the outside world begins to approach. Spanish explorers and colonizers enter the Southwest. They bring new animals, new weapons, new religions, new political systems, and new ideas about land and ownership. The encounter will change the region forever. Among the most important changes will be the arrival of sheep and goats. For the Diné, sheep will eventually become far more than livestock. They will become woven into the economy and daily life. Sheep will provide meat. Wool will become valuable. Weaving will flourish. Families will build wealth through their herds, and sheep will become part of the material culture that later generations would recognize as distinctly Diné. But the arrival of Europeans will also bring violence. The Spanish will seek control. Indigenous communities will resist. Pueblo peoples will rebel. The Diné will fight, trade, negotiate, and adapt. There will be periods of peace and periods of war. The Southwest will become a meeting ground between different worlds, and the Diné will learn to survive in that changing world. Before we continue deeper into that history, if you're enjoying this slow journey through the past, take a moment to support Whispered History. Please like this video, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and subscribe to the channel for more long-form historical stories designed for peaceful listening. Your support helps us continue bringing forgotten and fascinating chapters of history to life. Now, let us return to the Southwest, because the story of the Diné is only beginning. The first European encounters will introduce new possibilities, but they will also introduce new dangers. And as Spanish power spreads across the region, the people who call this land home will have to decide how they will respond. Some will resist, some will trade, some will negotiate, and many will do all three. The Diné will enter a new era, an era in which horses, sheep, Spanish settlements, Pueblo communities, and expanding colonial power will transform the Southwest. But through all of those changes, the mountains will remain. The homeland will remain, and the stories will remain. For the Diné, history will not simply be something that happened long ago. It will remain alive in the people who carry it forward. And that is where our journey continues. The Southwest was changing. Long before the arrival of American soldiers, before railroads crossed the desert, and before the borders of modern states were drawn across the land, the Diné were already building lives among the mesas, mountains, valleys, and high desert plains. Their world was not isolated. It was connected by trails, trade, family relationships, warfare, and ceremony. To understand the long history of the Diné, we have to understand that the Southwest was home to many indigenous peoples, each with their own languages, traditions, and histories. Among them were the Pueblo peoples, whose agricultural communities had existed in the region for centuries. The Diné interacted with these neighboring communities in many different ways. Sometimes they traded, sometimes they shared knowledge, sometimes families became connected through marriage, and sometimes they fought. This was a complicated world long before European powers attempted to control it. The Diné lived in an environment that demanded flexibility. The landscape could provide abundance in one season and scarcity in another. Rain could transform dry ground into fields of green. Then long periods of drought could challenge even experienced farmers. People therefore developed different ways of making a living. Agriculture became increasingly important. Corn was especially significant. It was not simply food. It was part of a broader cultural and spiritual world. Farming required knowledge of soil, rainfall, elevation, and seasons. Families learned where crops could survive. They understood the rhythms of the land, and they passed that knowledge to younger generations. But agriculture was only part of life. Hunting, gathering, trade, and eventually livestock herding all contributed to Diné survival. Then came one of the most important changes in southwestern history. The Spanish arrived. Spanish expeditions had begun entering the region during the 16th century. At first, the encounters were often distant. Explorers traveled through unfamiliar territory, recording what they saw and searching for routes and resources. But exploration eventually became colonization. Spanish settlements appeared, missions were established, soldiers arrived, and indigenous communities were increasingly drawn into a colonial system that was very different from their own. The Spanish brought Christianity. They brought new political authority. They brought horses, cattle, goats, and sheep. They also brought new forms of warfare. For the Diné, some of these changes would eventually become transformative. Perhaps no introduced animal would have a greater long-term influence than the sheep. Sheep began entering the Southwest through Spanish settlements. Over time, Diné families acquired sheep and goats. They learned how to raise them. They moved herds across the landscape. And gradually, sheep became central to Diné economic life. A flock could provide meat. It could provide wool. Wool could be spun into yarn. Yarn could be woven into blankets and clothing. A family's herd could represent security. It could be passed between generations, and it could provide a foundation for trade. The development of Diné weaving would become one of the most famous expressions of their culture. But this transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded over generations. The Diné adapted, introduced technology and animals to their own environment. This ability to adapt would become one of the defining characteristics of their history. The horse also changed the Southwest. Horses increased mobility. They made travel easier. They could carry supplies. They could be used for hunting, and they transformed warfare. A person who could travel quickly across enormous distances possessed a major advantage. The Diné became skilled horsemen. But horses were not simply tools. of war. They became part of a broader transformation in daily life. The Southwest became increasingly connected. People could travel farther, goods could move faster, raiding and trading could cover greater distances, and political relationships could change rapidly. The Spanish were not the only power shaping the region. Pueblo communities remained strong. The Diné continued to interact with them. Other indigenous nations moved through the region, and colonial settlements expanded. The result was a complicated frontier. There was no simple line separating indigenous people from Europeans. There were many overlapping relationships. Trade could occur between enemies. A community could cooperate with one group against another. Peace could exist for years before sudden conflict, and families could have connections across cultural boundaries. This complexity is important because later, histories sometimes describe the Southwest as if indigenous peoples and Europeans existed in two completely separate worlds. They did not. They were constantly interacting, and those interactions changed everyone. For the Diné, Spanish expansion created new dangers. Colonial authorities wanted land. Missionaries wanted to convert indigenous communities. Settlers wanted access to resources. And military commanders wanted to impose political control. The Diné resisted these pressures. Sometimes resistance took the form of armed conflict. Sometimes it involved moving away from Spanish settlements. Sometimes it involved trade and negotiation. Survival required flexibility. The Diné were not simply waiting for history to happen to them. They were making decisions. They chose when to fight. They chose when to negotiate. They chose where to live. They adapted foreign animals and technologies, and they maintained their own cultural traditions. Then came one of the most important events in the history of the Southwest. In 1680, Pueblo communities launched a major revolt against Spanish rule. The Pueblo Revolt drove the Spanish out of New Mexico for more than a decade. For the Diné, the upheaval created new opportunities and new dangers. Spanish authority temporarily weakened. Trade networks shifted. Political relationships changed. The Southwest entered a period of uncertainty. Eventually, the Spanish returned, but the balance had changed. Indigenous peoples had demonstrated that colonial control was not inevitable. The Diné continued to maintain their independence across much of their homeland. They could retreat into difficult terrain. They knew the mountains. They knew the canyons. They knew where water could be found, and they understood how to survive in a landscape that outsiders often found unforgiving. This knowledge would become extremely important in the centuries ahead, because the Spanish would not be the last outside power to seek control of Diné lands. After Mexican independence in 1821, the political situation changed again. Spain was no longer the dominant colonial power in the region. Mexico inherited control over much of the Southwest. But for the Diné, the change of flag did not necessarily mean a change in pressure. Mexican authorities still wanted control, settlers still wanted land, raiding and counter-raiding continued, trade continued, and warfare continued. The Diné became deeply involved in the regional economy. Their sheep herds expanded. Their weaving became increasingly important. Their horses increased mobility. Their communities spread across a broad homeland. By the early 19th century, the Diné were not a small, isolated people. They were a powerful indigenous society with an economy, political relationships, military traditions, and a strong connection to their homeland. But another transformation was approaching. American expansion was moving west. The United States had already become an independent nation. Its population was growing. Its leaders wanted new territory. And in 1848, after the Mexican-American War, the United States acquired a vast portion of the Southwest. Suddenly, the Diné found themselves facing a new power. American soldiers began appearing in the region. New forts were established. American officials began negotiating treaties. And the United States increasingly viewed the Southwest through the language of territorial control. For the Diné, this was the beginning of a dangerous new chapter. They had already dealt with Spanish colonization. They had dealt with Mexican authority. They had survived generations of conflict. But the United States possessed resources on a scale that would eventually make it far more difficult to resist. The American government wanted peace on its terms. Military commanders wanted security for settlers and roads. Settlers wanted land, and the Diné wanted something much simpler, to remain in their homeland. That conflict of interests would soon lead to war. The Diné would fight, they would negotiate, they would sign agreements, and some of those agreements would be broken. Eventually, American military campaigns would push thousands of Diné toward a place far from their homeland, a place that would become known in Diné history as Hueldi. But before that terrible journey, there would be years of tension, years of raids, years of retaliation, years of treaties and broken promises. The mountains would witness battles, the valleys would witness negotiations, and families would begin to understand that the world around them was changing faster than ever. The age of Spanish colonial power had passed. The Mexican period was fading. Now, the American frontier was arriving, and the long struggle between the United States and the Diné was about to begin. The world around the Diné was becoming more crowded. For generations, they had lived across a vast homeland of mesas, canyons, mountains, valleys, and high desert plains. They had learned to survive through farming, herding, hunting, gathering, trading, and movement. They had developed relationships with neighboring peoples. They had adapted horses and sheep to their way of life, and they had resisted outside attempts to control them. But by the early 19th century, the Southwest was entering another period of dramatic change. Spain was gone, Mexico had become independent, and the Diné now lived in a region where political boundaries were changing faster than people could adjust to them. For the Diné, the land remained home, political governments might change, but the mountains did not, the fields did not, the sacred places did not, the relationships between families did not. Yet the arrival of Mexican authority brought new pressures. The Mexican government claimed sovereignty over the region. Settlements expanded. Livestock became more valuable. Trade routes became increasingly important, and conflicts between different communities continued. The Diné were not simply victims of these changes. They remained active participants in the regional world. They traded with Mexican settlements. They exchanged livestock and goods. They negotiated with officials. And sometimes they raided. Raiding was part of a much larger frontier environment in which many different groups competed for livestock, resources, and security. It is important not to imagine this period as a simple conflict between two sides. The Southwest contained many peoples and communities: Diné, Pueblo peoples, Mexican settlers, Apache groups, Comanche groups, later American settlers and soldiers. Relationships shifted constantly. An enemy in one year could become a trading partner in another. A peace agreement might last for a generation, or collapse after a single incident. This was the world into which the Diné entered the 19th century. Their economy was also changing. Sheep herding had become increasingly important. A healthy flock represented wealth. Sheep provided food. Their wool could be spun and woven. Diné weavers developed techniques that eventually became famous throughout the Southwest. Blankets were not merely practical objects. They could be beautiful works of art. Patterns, colors, and techniques were passed from one generation to another. A weaving could represent hours, days, or weeks of work, and behind every blanket was knowledge. Knowledge of wool, knowledge of plants used for dyes, knowledge of spinning, knowledge of the loom, knowledge passed between generations. The Diné were also farmers. Corn remained deeply important. Beans and squash could complement the harvest. Gardens were carefully managed. Families understood how to use different elevations and microclimates in a land where water could be unpredictable. This knowledge was essential. The Diné also maintained strong connections to their clans. Clan identity helped people understand who they were and how they were connected to others. Marriage customs created networks between communities. Kinship provided support during difficult times. And traditional teachings gave meaning to the landscape. These institutions would become extremely important when outside governments attempted to break Diné society apart. But for now, the Diné were still living largely on their own terms. Then the United States began moving west. The United States had been expanding for decades. Its population was growing rapidly. Settlers were moving across the continent. The government wanted access to new land, and the idea of American expansion was becoming increasingly powerful. The Mexican-American War transformed the Southwest. Between 1846 and 1848, the United States and Mexico fought over territory and political control. When the war ended, Mexico ceded a vast amount of territory to the United States. The Diné suddenly found themselves living inside a new geopolitical system. The American government now claimed authority over their homeland. American military expeditions entered the region. Forts were established. Surveyors and officials traveled through the country, and American settlers began arriving in increasing numbers. The Diné had seen foreign governments before. They had dealt with Spain. They had dealt with Mexico. But the United States was different. Its military resources were immense. Its population was expanding, and its government had a growing interest in controlling indigenous peoples and their lands. At first, the United States attempted to negotiate. Treaties were proposed, promises were made. The Diné were encouraged to accept peace, but peace was difficult. The frontier was unstable, raiding continued, livestock was stolen, retaliatory attacks followed, settlers demanded protection, military commanders demanded authority, and Diné leaders tried to protect their communities. The situation became increasingly dangerous. American officials often viewed the Diné through the language of military security. They wanted to stop raids. They wanted to protect settlements. They wanted to control movement. And increasingly, Majas, they wanted the Diné confined to specific territory. For the Diné, this was unacceptable. Their homeland was not simply a piece of land that could be assigned by a government. Their identity was connected to the landscape itself. The sacred mountains defined their world. Their fields, grazing areas, springs, and communities were interconnected. Restricting movement could threaten their way of life, and so negotiations repeatedly failed. Treaties were made, then broken. Temporary peace was established, then violence returned. One of the most important early agreements came in 1846. A treaty was made between the United States and Diné leaders. The agreement was intended to establish peace, but it did not resolve the underlying problems. American expansion continued. Diné communities continued defending themselves, and local conflicts continued to spiral. The situation became worse as more American troops entered the Southwest. One military officer would become particularly important in the coming years. His name was James H. Carleton. Another was Christopher Kit Carson. Carson would eventually lead one of the most devastating campaigns in Diné history. But that moment had not yet arrived. Before the Great Campaign, there were years of smaller conflicts, military expeditions, raids, negotiations, retaliation, and attempts to force the Diné into a system of reservation life. The American government believed that concentrating indigenous peoples in designated areas would make them easier to control. The Diné saw something very different. They saw the possibility of losing their homeland, and they understood what that could mean. If they lost access to their fields, they could not farm. If they lost their grazing land, their sheep would disappear. If they were separated from sacred places, their relationship with the homeland would be damaged. If families were scattered, clan relationships could be weakened. This was more than a dispute over territory. It was a conflict over an entire way of life. The Diné therefore continued to resist. Some leaders sought peace, others supported armed resistance. Many families simply tried to survive. Some moved deeper into remote areas. Canyons and mountains provided shelter. The landscape that had sustained Diné life for generations could also provide protection from soldiers. But the American military learned the terrain, and the pressure increased. By the early 1860s, the United States was consumed by another enormous conflict. The Civil War had begun. Yet even while Americans fought one another across the East, the government continued its campaigns in the Southwest. Military commanders wanted to secure the region. They feared alliances between indigenous nations and Confederate forces. They wanted to protect strategic routes, and they wanted to impose control over the Diné and other indigenous peoples. The stage was now set for a confrontation unlike anything the Diné had experienced before. A campaign would be launched against their homeland. Crops would be destroyed, sheep herds would be targeted, orchards would be cut down, communities would be driven from their homes, and thousands of Diné would eventually be forced to march hundreds of miles away. That journey would become known as the Long Walk. But before the march, there would be resistance. There would be leaders who refused to surrender. There would be battles. And there would be a military strategy designed not simply to defeat Diné warriors, but to make life in their homeland impossible. The Diné were about to face one of the darkest chapters in their history, and at the center of it would stand a young military officer named Kit Carson. Part 4, The Coming of the American Army. The year was 1861. Across the United States, a terrible war had begun. North and South were fighting one another, and the future of the country was uncertain. But far to the west, another struggle was unfolding. The Diné were facing increasing pressure from American military forces. Their homeland was vast. Their communities were spread across mountains, valleys, mesas, and canyons. American officials wanted greater control over the region, and the conflict that had been growing for years was moving toward a breaking point. For the Diné, this was not simply another political disagreement. It was a struggle over whether they would remain in their homeland. The United States wanted peace on its own terms. Military commanders wanted the raids to end. Settlers wanted protection. And government officials increasingly believed that the Diné should be removed from large portions of their traditional territory. But the Diné had no intention of simply disappearing. They continued farming, they continued raising sheep, they continued trading, and some groups continued resisting American military pressure. Among the Diné, there was no single leader who commanded every family. Different communities had their own leaders and local circumstances. Some favored negotiation, some favored resistance, some tried to avoid both sides. This made the conflict complicated. American officers could not simply defeat one army and declare victory. The Diné were not gathered in one city. They lived across an enormous homeland. They knew the terrain. They could disappear into canyons. They could move their families. They could protect livestock. They could return after soldiers had left. To American commanders, this was frustrating. To the Diné, it was survival. The landscape itself became part of the struggle. A canyon could provide shelter, a mountain could hide a family, a remote valley could protect a field, a spring could mean the difference between life and death. The Diné knew these places because they had lived there for generations. American soldiers often depended upon maps, scouts, and local guides. But the land was enormous, and every expedition was difficult. Meanwhile, the Civil War created new fears among American military leaders. The Southwest was strategically important. Federal commanders wanted to prevent Confederate influence from spreading westward. They wanted to protect military routes and settlements. And they wanted to establish stronger control over indigenous nations. One of the men who became deeply involved in this campaign was Brigadier General James H. Carleton. Carleton was determined to reshape the Southwest. He believed that military force could solve the region's problems, and he wanted the Diné removed from their homeland. To accomplish this, he would rely heavily on another famous frontier figure, Christopher Kit Carson. Carson had already spent decades traveling through the West. He had worked as a trapper, guide, scout, and soldier. He knew the landscape better than many American officers, but his reputation has changed dramatically over time. In older popular stories, Carson was often portrayed as a heroic frontier explorer. The reality is more complicated. During the campaign against the Diné, Carson became the commander responsible for carrying out a destructive military strategy. His orders were not limited to defeating warriors in battle. The objective was to destroy the economic foundation that allowed Diné communities to remain in their homeland. That meant targeting crops. It meant destroying fields. It meant cutting down orchards. It meant capturing or killing livestock. And it meant forcing families into submission. The strategy was brutal. If people could no longer grow food, if their sheep were gone, if their orchards were destroyed, then remaining in the homeland would become increasingly difficult. The campaign began gathering momentum in 1863. Carson's troops moved through Diné territory. Some communities resisted, others attempted to negotiate. Many families tried to escape, but the American military continued advancing. Imagine the fear of watching soldiers approach your home. A field that had taken months to cultivate could be destroyed in a day. A flock of sheep could disappear. An orchard planted years earlier could be cut down. A family could be forced to abandon its home. The consequences extended far beyond the battlefield. This was warfare against a way of life. And the Diné responded in different ways. Some warriors attacked American troops. Others moved their families into remote areas. Some leaders attempted to negotiate. But the military campaign continued. One of the most important figures among the Diné was Manuelito. He was a respected leader and warrior who resisted American attempts to force the Diné from their homeland. Another important leader was Barbonchito. He also resisted removal and later played an important role in negotiations. Their resistance demonstrated that the Diné were not simply surrendering. They were fighting for their families, for their livestock, for their fields, and for their homeland. But the situation became increasingly desperate. American troops destroyed food supplies. Families faced hunger. Some people began surrendering. Others continued hiding in remote areas. The winter of 1863 and 1864 brought even greater hardship. The Diné were being pushed toward a decision: remain in the homeland and risk starvation or continued military attacks, or surrender and accept removal. For many families, there was no good choice. Then came the orders for a mass removal. The destination was Bosque Redondo near Fort Sumner in what is now New Mexico. The distance was enormous. The environment there was unfamiliar. The Diné knew the mountains and deserts of their homeland. They did not know the new place where American authorities intended to confine them. The military called it a reservation, but for the Diné, it was exile. Thousands would eventually be forced to leave their homeland. They would walk. Some would have horses or wagons. Many would have very little. Families would carry what they could. Elders would struggle. Children would suffer. And those who were already weakened by hunger faced an especially difficult journey. This would become one of the defining events in Diné history, the Long Walk. But before the Great March began, the final stages of the military campaign continued. Carson's troops searched the countryside. They destroyed additional resources. They pursued groups who refused to surrender. The message was becoming unmistakable. There would be no return to the old relationship between the Diné and the American government. The United States intended to remove them. And gradually, more and more Diné leaders realized that continued resistance could lead to even greater suffering. Some began surrendering. Others waited. Some continued to resist. The homeland became quieter. Fields were abandoned. Sheep herds were reduced. Families gathered in groups, uncertain about what would happen next. The mountains remained unchanged. The sacred peaks still stood on the horizon. The canyons still carried water. The land was still home. But the people who had lived there for generations were being forced away. In 1864, the Long Walk began. Hundreds of miles lay ahead. The Diné would be marched toward Bosque Redondo. They would leave behind the places where their families had lived. They would leave fields and orchards. They would leave sacred landscapes. They would leave graves, and they would enter an uncertain future. The journey would become one of the most painful memories in Diné history, but it would also become part of a much larger story, a story of survival, because the Diné would eventually return, and when they did, they would begin rebuilding their homeland and their nation. But first, they had to survive Hueldi. In the winter of 1864, the Diné homeland was growing quieter. The fields that had once been planted with corn were abandoned. Many sheep were gone. Orchards had been destroyed. Families who had lived among the mountains for generations were gathering at military posts. They had little choice. The American campaign had made remaining in their homeland increasingly difficult. For those who surrendered, another journey was waiting. A journey that would become one of the deepest memories in Diné history, the Long Walk. The destination was Bosque Redondo, near Fort Sumner in eastern New Mexico. It was hundreds of miles from the heart of Diné Bikea. The landscape there was completely different. The Diné were accustomed to their mountains, canyons, springs, forests, and familiar fields. Bosque Redondo was a distant place along the Pecos River. For the people being sent there, it was not home. The journey itself was difficult. Families had to travel together. Elders struggled to keep pace. Children were carried when they became exhausted. People who were sick or weakened by hunger faced enormous danger. Some had little clothing. Some had little food. The weather could be cold. The roads were rough, and there was uncertainty about what awaited them at the end. The people who had begun the journey did not all arrive. Some died along the way. Others became separated from relatives. For the Diné, the Long Walk was more than a military relocation. It was the forced separation of people from their homeland. The places they were leaving behind were filled with memories. A field might have belonged to a family for generations. A mountain might have been connected to stories and ceremonies. A spring might have been known by a particular family. A grave might have marked the resting place of an ancestor. Leaving meant abandoning all of this. And still, They walked. Some traveled in groups, others arrived separately. Different groups were brought toward Bosque Redondo at different times. The journey became a series of marches rather than one single procession. The people arriving at the reservation were expected to begin a new life. American officials believed that agriculture could be established there. They imagined the Diné becoming settled farmers. But the plan was deeply flawed. The environment presented serious challenges. Water was not always reliable. The soil was difficult. Crops struggled. The area was far from the Diné homeland, and the reservation had to support thousands of people. The first months were extremely difficult. People were hungry, disease spread, supplies were inadequate. The government struggled to provide what had been promised. The Diné had lost much of their livestock. They had lost access to familiar hunting areas, and they were expected to grow crops in an unfamiliar environment. The Pecos River could provide water, but it also created problems. Flooding could damage fields. The soil was not always suitable for the crops the Diné had traditionally grown. The climate was different from what many families knew. The experiment at Bosque Redondo was becoming a failure. Yet the Diné adapted. They always had. They found ways to survive. They shared food. They maintained family relationships. They preserved ceremonies. They taught children. They continued speaking their language. And they remembered the homeland. That memory became extremely important, even though they were far away. Diné identity remained connected to Diné Bikea. The mountains still existed. The sacred places were still there. The people had not forgotten them. They wanted to return. Meanwhile, conditions at Bosque Redondo continued to deteriorate. The government had underestimated the cost of maintaining such a large population. Supplies were expensive to transport. The reservation was difficult to manage, and the promised agricultural future was not developing as planned. Disease remained a problem. Food shortages continued. The Diné understood that the reservation could not sustain them indefinitely. Their leaders, therefore, began pushing for another solution. They wanted to go home. Among the leaders involved in negotiations was Barbonchito. He had resisted American military campaigns but understood that the Diné needed a way out of the reservation system at Bosque Redondo. Other leaders also participated. They did not all agree on every issue, but the desire to return to the homeland was widespread. There was another problem. The United States government had spent enormous amounts of money on the Bosque Redondo experiment. The project was becoming politically unpopular. Officials began considering alternatives. Eventually, negotiations began that would lead to one of the most important agreements in Diné history, the Treaty of 1868. For the Diné, the treaty would mean more than an end to exile. It would establish a reservation in part of their traditional homeland. It would allow the people to return, and it would provide the legal foundation for the Navajo Nation's relationship with the United States for generations to come. But before that agreement could be reached, the Diné had to endure the final months at Bosque Redondo. They had already experienced years of warfare. They had watched their homeland destroyed. They had walked hundreds of miles. They had buried relatives, and they had survived an environment that was never meant to become their permanent home. Still, they had not lost themselves. Their language survived. Their clans survived. Their ceremonies survived. Their memories survived. Their songs survived. And their desire to return home remained strong. Then, in the spring of 1868, a delegation traveled to Washington, D.C. to discuss the future. The negotiations were difficult. The United States wanted an agreement that would establish peace. The Diné wanted a homeland. They wanted security. They wanted the ability to rebuild their lives, and they wanted assurances that they would not simply be removed again. The resulting treaty was signed on June 1st, 1868. It became a turning point. The United States recognized a reservation for the Diné. The Diné agreed to peace with the United States. The government promised assistance. And most importantly, the Diné were allowed to leave Bosque Redondo and return to their homeland. After 4 years of exile, the journey home could begin. Think about what that meant. People who had been forced away from their mountains were finally walking toward them again. Families who had lost their fields could begin planting again. Sheep could be raised again. Homes could be rebuilt. Ceremonies could once again take place in familiar landscapes. The return did not erase the suffering. It did not bring back those who had died. It did not restore everything that had been destroyed. And it did not end conflict with the United States, but it gave the Diné something enormously important, a homeland recognized by treaty, a place where they could rebuild, a foundation for political sovereignty, a future. The people began the journey back. They were returning to a landscape that had been changed by war, but the mountains were still there. The sacred peaks still stood. The land still carried the memory of their ancestors, and the people were coming home. The long walk had become part of their history, but it had not become the end of their history. Instead, it became a chapter in a much longer story of survival. The Diné had been driven from their homeland. They had endured Hueldi. They had survived hunger and disease. They had resisted attempts to erase their identity. And now, they were going home. The next chapter would not be easy. They would have to rebuild their economy, rebuild their communities, rebuild their herds, protect their language and traditions, and defend the promises contained in the treaty. But for the first time in years, the road ahead was leading toward home. The year was 1868. After 4 years at Bosque Redondo, the Diné were finally preparing to leave. For the people who had survived the long walk, the news must have carried many emotions: relief, hope, grief, and uncertainty. They were going home, but home was no longer exactly as they had left it. Fields had been abandoned. Homes had disappeared. Orchards had been damaged or destroyed. Sheep herds had been scattered, and many relatives would never return. The long walk had taken lives. Bosque Redondo had taken more. Disease and hunger had weakened families. Yet the Diné had preserved something that no military campaign had been able to destroy: their identity, their language, their clans, their ceremonies, their memories, and their connection to the homeland. The Treaty of 1868 created the legal foundation for their return. The agreement established a reservation within part of the traditional Diné homeland. It also created obligations for both sides. The United States promised assistance and protection. The Diné agreed to peace and accepted certain restrictions. The treaty also marked the beginning of a new relationship between the Diné and the United States government. It would not always be a peaceful relationship. There would be disputes, there would be disagreements over land, there would be conflicts over livestock and resources. But the treaty itself became incredibly important. It recognized the Diné as a distinct political community with a homeland of its own. And that homeland was something the Diné could return to. The journey from Bosque Redondo began. Families gathered what possessions they had. They prepared to travel west. This journey was very different from the long walk. They were not being driven into exile. They were returning. The mountains were ahead. The familiar landscape was waiting. And as the people approached their homeland, the emotional meaning of the journey became even greater. For years they had spoken about returning. Now they could see the mountains again. The sacred peaks that had defined their homeland were no longer distant memories. They were becoming visible on the horizon. The Diné were home, but returning home did not mean that life immediately became easy. The people had to rebuild almost everything. They needed food, they needed livestock, they needed homes, they needed farming tools, they needed seed, they needed to restore communities. The government promised supplies and assistance, but deliveries were sometimes inadequate or delayed. The Diné therefore relied heavily upon themselves. They had survived before, now they would rebuild. Sheep became especially important. The animals provided food and wool. They could be traded, they could reproduce, and they could help families regain economic independence. Over time, sheep herding became deeply woven into Diné life. The same was true of weaving. Women continued developing sophisticated weaving traditions. Blankets and rugs became important household objects and valuable trade goods. Diné weaving would eventually become famous far beyond the reservation. But behind every beautiful textile was a family tradition. Skills were taught from one generation to another. Patterns were remembered. Techniques were refined. And weaving became one of the ways cultural knowledge continued. Agriculture also returned. Families replanted corn. They cultivated beans and squash. They rebuilt fields. They used irrigation where possible. The goal was not simply to survive, it was to restore a way of life. The treaty reservation was not identical to the enormous homeland the Diné had occupied before American expansion, but it provided a foundation. And over time, additional lands would be added to the reservation. The Navajo reservation would eventually become the largest reservation in the United States by land area. That expansion did not happen all at once. It occurred through later agreements, executive actions, and changes in federal policy. But the foundation was laid in 1868. The Diné were rebuilding. Their political leadership also began adapting to a new reality. They now had to deal with federal officials on a continuing basis. Government agents appeared, schools were established, trading posts developed, missionaries arrived, and American institutions increasingly entered Diné communities. This created new opportunities, but it also created new pressures. The United States government wanted to change indigenous life. Officials often believed that Native peoples should adopt American farming practices, English, Christianity, and European American social customs. The Diné had other ideas. They wanted access to education and trade when useful, but they also wanted to preserve their own identity. This tension would become one of the defining themes of the next century. The federal government increasingly tried to control Diné children through schools. At first, education could occur near communities. Later, children were sent to boarding schools farther away. There, many were punished for speaking their language. Their hair could be cut. Their clothing was changed. Their names might be altered. They were taught that their traditional culture was something they needed to abandon. For Diné families, this was deeply painful. Parents had already experienced forced removal. Now they faced another threat: the possibility that their children might grow up disconnected from their language and traditions. But once again, the Diné adapted. They found ways to preserve what mattered. Grandparents taught stories. Families continued ceremonies. The Navajo language survived in homes and communities. Clan relationships remained important, and traditional knowledge continued to pass from one generation to another. The federal government could control schools. It could control reservation boundaries. It could create regulations, but it could not completely control memory, and memory became a form of resistance. As the 19th century came to an end, the Diné population began recovering from the devastation of the previous decades. Communities expanded, sheep herds grew, trading posts became centers of economic activity. Diné artisans produced textiles, silverwork, and other goods. The reservation became increasingly connected to the outside economy, but this connection brought new problems. Outside traders sometimes exploited Diné producers. Federal policies increasingly interfered with traditional land use, and the government remained interested in controlling how the Diné used their land. The most controversial issue would eventually become livestock. For the Diné, sheep and goats were central to family life. For federal officials, large herds were increasingly viewed as a problem. Officials argued that overgrazing was damaging the land. They wanted to reduce livestock numbers. This would eventually lead to one of the most painful federal interventions of the 20th century. But before that happened, another transformation was approaching. The modern American economy was moving west. Railroads were expanding. Markets were growing. New technologies were arriving. The reservation was no longer isolated from the wider United States, and younger Diné would increasingly encounter two worlds: the world of their ancestors and the rapidly changing world of modern America. The challenge would be enormous. How could the Diné participate in a changing economy without losing their identity? How could they protect their homeland while dealing with a powerful federal government? How could they preserve language and ceremony while their children entered American schools? These questions would shape generations. But the Diné had already survived something that seemed impossible. They had survived the long walk. They had survived Bosque Redondo. They had returned home, and now they faced a different kind of struggle. Not a war fought primarily with rifles and soldiers, but a long struggle over culture, education, land, and sovereignty. The next century would test them in ways no battlefield could, and yet the story would continue to demonstrate the same remarkable pattern. The Diné would adapt, they would resist, they would negotiate, they would preserve, and they would continue building a future in the homeland they had fought so hard to regain. The return home had given the Diné something precious, a homeland. But having a homeland was not the same as having complete freedom. After 1868, the Diné entered a new chapter of their history. There would be no massive army marching across their fields as there had been during the campaign of the 1860s. Instead, a different kind of pressure began to grow. Government agents arrived, schools appeared, traders established stores, missionaries entered communities. Federal officials began creating rules about land, livestock, education, and daily life. The United States had recognized a Diné reservation through the Treaty of 1868. But American officials still believed that indigenous people should eventually be transformed into something resembling white American farmers and citizens. They called this process civilization. For the Diné, it often meant something very different. It meant changing how children were educated. It meant changing how families used their land. It meant discouraging traditional ceremonies. It meant encouraging English instead of Diné Bizad. And increasingly, it meant trying to reshape Diné identity itself. But the Diné had already demonstrated that they could adapt without abandoning who they were. That ability would become essential. During the late 19th century, the reservation slowly developed. Trading posts became important places where families could exchange wool, livestock, blankets, and other goods. Diné weavers became increasingly respected. Their blankets were practical, beautiful, and valuable. Sheep remained central to many households. A family with a healthy flock possessed an important source of food and income. Sheep also connected generations. Children learned how to care for animals. Families moved between grazing areas. Wool became yarn. Yarn became woven cloth. And woven cloth could become a source of income. This was an economy built around both tradition and adaptation. But federal officials increasingly worried about the size of Diné livestock herds. They argued that grazing was damaging the reservation. Some of these concerns were connected to real environmental pressures. The Southwest was a difficult environment. Drought could weaken grasslands. Large herds could put pressure on limited resources. But the solution proposed by federal authorities would eventually become deeply controversial. Before that crisis arrived, another major institution was expanding, the boarding school. American officials believed that education could transform indigenous communities. Children were therefore increasingly encouraged, and sometimes forced, to attend schools designed according to federal assimilation policies. Some schools were located on or near the reservation. Others were far away. Children could be separated from their families for long periods. For a Diné child, this could be frightening. Imagine growing up surrounded by familiar voices. You know the language spoken by your parents. You know your clan relationships. You know the landscape. You know the stories of your family. Then suddenly, you are taken somewhere unfamiliar. You hear English. You are surrounded by people you do not know. Your hair may be cut. Your clothing may be changed. Your traditional practices may be discouraged or forbidden. And you are told that the culture you came from must be replaced. This was not simply education. It was an attempt at cultural transformation. Many indigenous children across the United States experienced similar policies. The goal was assimilation, but the Diné did not simply disappear into the system. Children remembered, families remembered, and many former students later carried complicated memories of both the opportunities and the harms associated with boarding schools. Education could provide literacy and access to new forms of employment, but it could also cause deep cultural and emotional wounds. The struggle over language became especially important. Diné Bizad was not merely a communication tool. It carried stories, relationships, concepts, and ways of understanding the world. When a language is weakened, an entire body of cultural knowledge can be placed at risk. Yet the language survived. It continued in homes, it continued in ceremonies, it continued between relatives, and it would eventually become an important symbol of cultural pride. Meanwhile, the reservation itself was changing. The American economy was expanding. Railroads reached deeper into the Southwest. Markets grew. Trading posts became more important. American settlers moved into surrounding areas. The Diné were increasingly connected to the wider national economy. This created opportunities, but it also created new forms of dependence. Families could earn money from livestock and crafts, but prices were often controlled by outside traders. Federal agents could influence economic decisions, and land itself remained a constant source of concern. The reservation was not always treated as though the Diné possessed complete control over it. Federal officials frequently claimed authority over land use. They made decisions about resources. They regulated livestock. They established schools. They appointed agents. The Diné, therefore, had to navigate a complicated political relationship. The treaty had recognized their homeland, but the federal government still exercised enormous power. This tension would continue for generations. Then came the issue of land allotment. Across the United States, federal policy increasingly promoted dividing indigenous communal lands into individual allotments. The idea was that indigenous families would receive individual parcels and become private farmers, but the policy could weaken tribal landholding. Once land was divided, it could be sold, it could be inherited in complicated ways, and non-indigenous interests could gain access to lands that had once been held collectively. The Diné resisted many of these policies. They understood that land was not simply a commodity. It was connected to family, community, history, and identity. The reservation, therefore, became a place of continuing political struggle, but it was also becoming a place of cultural renewal. Communities were rebuilding, families were growing, traditional ceremonies continued, weaving flourished, sheep herding remained important, and Diné leaders increasingly recognized the need for stronger political organization. They would eventually develop new institutions for representing the people in negotiations with the United States government. This process was gradual. There was no single moment when modern Diné political life suddenly appeared. Instead, it developed through decades of experience. Diné leaders learned how to negotiate with federal officials. They learned how American laws worked. They learned how treaties could be used to defend their rights. And they began building political institutions capable of representing communities across the reservation. This would become extremely important in the 20th century because new challenges were coming. The outside world was becoming increasingly interested in the resources beneath the Southwest: coal, oil, gas, and eventually, uranium. The reservation contained valuable natural resources. American companies and government agencies would eventually seek access to them. For the Diné, these resources represented both opportunity and danger. Mining could provide jobs. It could bring money into communities, but it could also damage land and water. The consequences would become particularly severe with uranium. But before that story unfolded, the world was entering another great crisis. Europe was moving toward war. America would eventually enter the conflict, and young Diné men would volunteer for military service. Some of them would perform a role so remarkable that their language would become part of American military history. They would become known as the Navajo Code Talkers, but their story would not begin on the battlefield. It began with a language that government schools had once tried to suppress, a language that families had protected, a language that had survived, and soon, that language would help carry American military messages across the Pacific. The world was changing again. The Diné had spent generations defending their homeland, adapting to new political realities, and preserving traditions that outside governments had repeatedly tried to reshape. Now, in the early 20th century, another transformation was approaching. Modern America was expanding rapidly. Automobiles were appearing on roads. Railroads connected distant cities. Electricity was changing daily life, and the United States was becoming increasingly involved in international conflicts. For the Diné, these changes created both opportunities and new challenges. Young people were entering schools. Families were participating in wage labor. Trading posts connected remote communities with national markets. But traditional life remained deeply important. Sheep still grazed across the reservation. Corn was still planted. Weaving continued. Ceremonies continued. Diné Bizad was still spoken. And family and clan relationships remained central. Then in 1914, Europe descended into the First World War. The United States entered the conflict in 1917. Diné men served in the American military. Their participation reflected a pattern that would become increasingly important. Even while the federal government was attempting to assimilate indigenous people. Indigenous men and women were also serving the United States. They were proving themselves in ways that challenged many of the stereotypes surrounding Native peoples. But the most famous chapter would come during the Second World War. In 1941, the United States entered another global conflict. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had transformed the country overnight. American military commanders needed secure communications. Radio messages were essential, but radio transmissions had a serious weakness. The enemy could intercept them. If the Japanese military could understand the messages, they could potentially discover American plans. The military therefore needed communication systems that were difficult to understand. And someone recognized an unusual possibility: the Diné language. Diné Bizad was not widely understood outside Diné communities. It was complex. Its grammar was unfamiliar to English speakers, and it had never been systematically used as a military code. In 1942, the United States Marine Corps began recruiting Diné men to experiment with using their language for military communications. Among the early recruits was Philip Johnston. Johnston was not Diné himself, but he had grown up around Diné people and understood the language. He believed it could be useful. The idea was tested. Diné speakers were asked to transmit military messages. The results were impressive. The language allowed messages to be transmitted rapidly. But there was a problem. A language alone was not enough. If the enemy somehow obtained a native speaker or a detailed linguistic analysis, some messages might eventually be interpreted. So the Marines developed a specialized code based on Diné Bizad. Military terms that did not have direct Diné equivalents were assigned words. Aircraft, ships, weapons, officers, and military operations could be represented through carefully chosen terms. The code was memorized. There were no written code books carried into combat whenever possible. The men learned the system through training, and that became one of its greatest strengths. The code talkers could communicate quickly. They could encode and decode messages almost instantly. The Japanese military had difficulty understanding them. The program expanded. More Diné men joined the Marines. They trained, they learned military procedures, they practiced communication under pressure, and eventually they were sent into combat. The first major deployment came during the Battle of Guadalcanal. The Pacific War was brutal. American forces were fighting across islands thousands of miles from home. The terrain was difficult, the weather was harsh, and communications could determine whether an operation succeeded or failed. The code talkers transmitted battlefield messages. They reported troop movements, they communicated coordinates, they relayed orders, and they helped maintain communication during some of the most intense fighting of the war. Their contribution was remarkable, but there is an important irony in their story. Only a generation earlier, the federal government had operated schools where indigenous children could be punished for speaking their own languages. Now, the United States military was depending on Diné Bizad. The language that officials had once tried to suppress had become a military asset. This contradiction reveals something important about American history. Policies can change, attitudes can change, but cultures often survive longer than governments expect. The code talkers were not simply using a military code. They were demonstrating the continued strength of their language, and they were serving their country while carrying a language rooted in their own homeland. Diné men served throughout the Pacific Campaign. They participated in major battles. They faced danger. Some were wounded. Some were killed. And those who survived returned home carrying experiences that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. Their contribution was kept relatively secret for decades. The military did not publicly reveal the full importance of the system during the war. The secrecy was necessary. If the Japanese had understood how the communication system worked, its effectiveness could have been compromised. So the Code Talkers returned home without receiving the recognition they deserved immediately. Many resumed ordinary lives. They returned to their families. They returned to the reservation. Some became farmers. Some worked in other occupations. Some continued military service, and many rarely spoke publicly about their wartime experiences. The broader Diné community was also changing. World War II had accelerated economic transformation. Young people were traveling beyond the reservation. They encountered cities, factories, military bases, universities, and a rapidly modernizing America. Some returned home with new skills and ambitions. Others settled away from the reservation. The war, therefore, created new connections between the Diné community and the wider United States. But the old challenges had not disappeared. Land remained an issue. Federal control remained. Economic inequality remained. And the government continued to influence reservation life. Then, another resource became increasingly important: uranium. During the Second World War, and especially the Cold War, the United States became intensely interested in uranium. The mineral was essential to the development of nuclear weapons and later nuclear energy. Large deposits existed on and around Diné lands. Mining companies began operating in the region. For many Diné families, uranium mining initially appeared to offer opportunity. Jobs were available, wages could be higher than other local employment. Mining could bring money into communities that had limited economic options, but the long-term consequences were devastating. Many miners worked without adequate knowledge of the dangers of radiation. Protective measures were often inadequate. Mines were sometimes poorly ventilated. Radioactive dust could enter workers' lungs. Waste materials could remain near communities, and contaminated water sources could affect families and livestock. The effects would not always be immediately visible. There was no dramatic explosion, no battlefield, no marching army. Instead, the danger could be invisible. It could remain underground. It could settle into dust. It could enter water. And it could remain in the landscape long after a mine closed. The Diné would spend decades confronting the consequences. For now, however, Sumai, the war had ended. The United States had emerged as a global superpower. The Diné had contributed to that victory. The Code Talkers had helped protect American communications. Yet the people who had provided this service were still living with the consequences of federal policies that had shaped their communities for generations. Their language had helped win battles, but their homeland was becoming the site of another struggle. A struggle over natural resources, a struggle over health, a struggle over environmental protection, and eventually a struggle over who had the right to decide what happened to Diné land. The 20th century was bringing the Diné new opportunities, but it was also bringing new dangers. And the next chapter would reveal just how complicated that modern history would become. The war was over. The Diné men who had served in the American military were returning home. Some came back to the reservation carrying medals. Some returned with memories they rarely discussed. And some never returned at all. Among those who had served were the men who had used Diné Bazad to transmit military messages across the Pacific. Their contribution had been extraordinary. But the story of the Diné after World War II would not simply be a story of military recognition. It would become a story about land, about health, about natural resources, and about the difficult question of who had the right to make decisions on Diné land. The United States had entered a new era. The Second World War had demonstrated the power of modern technology. Then came the Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union entered a global competition involving weapons, military alliances, science, and nuclear technology. Uranium became enormously valuable, and the Southwest contained significant uranium deposits. Many of those deposits were located on or near Diné lands. Mining companies began searching for ore. Mines opened, workers were recruited, and for many Diné families, the opportunity seemed promising. Jobs were scarce in many reservation communities. A mining job could provide regular wages. It could help support a family. It could provide an alternative to farming or livestock, and few workers fully understood the dangers they were facing. The science of radiation was already known, but workers were not always adequately protected. Ventilation inside mines could be poor. Radioactive dust could fill the air. Protective equipment was limited, and workers could spend years underground without understanding what exposure might eventually mean. Some miners carried radioactive dust home on their clothing. Their families could be exposed. Waste rock could remain near communities. Abandoned mines could leave contaminated areas behind, and water sources could become polluted. The danger was often invisible. There was no warning sound, no obvious change in the landscape. A person could breathe contaminated dust without realizing it, and the consequences might not appear until years later. Cancer rates among uranium miners became a major concern. Families began experiencing illnesses that were difficult to understand. The connection between mining and health problems became increasingly clear over time. But recognition came slowly. For decades, many Diné families carried the consequences of uranium mining. Some communities lived near abandoned mines. Children played around mine sites. Livestock grazed nearby. Water sources were sometimes contaminated, and families often lacked clear information about the risks. The land that had sustained Diné communities for generations was now carrying an invisible legacy of the nuclear age. This became one of the great environmental struggles in modern Diné history. But uranium was not the only issue. Coal was also becoming increasingly important. Large coal deposits existed beneath parts of the reservation. Energy companies wanted access to them. Coal could generate electricity. The region was becoming more connected to the national power grid, and the federal government saw energy development as a path toward economic growth. For some Diné leaders and families, mining offered jobs and revenue. For others, it threatened land, water, grazing areas, and sacred places. The debate was not simple. Economic opportunity was desperately needed, but economic development could also create long-term costs. This tension would appear again and again. What does development mean when the land itself is part of your identity? What happens when a resource beneath your homeland is worth millions of dollars? Who decides whether it should be extracted? The federal government? A tribal government? Individual land users? Mining companies? These questions became central to modern Diné politics. At the same time, the Diné were building stronger political institutions. The Navajo Nation government evolved over the 20th century. Diné leaders increasingly worked through formal political structures. They negotiated with federal agencies. They defended treaty rights. They argued over land. They sought economic development, and they worked to strengthen political sovereignty. Sovereignty became an especially important concept. The Diné were not simply residents of a reservation. They were members of a distinct tribal nation. The Treaty of 1868 remained a foundation of that relationship. It had created a recognized homeland, but the exact meaning of sovereignty continued to be contested. Federal law could affect tribal authority. Congress could pass legislation affecting reservations. Federal agencies could regulate resources. The Navajo Nation had to operate within a complicated legal system. Yet the government increasingly became an important expression of Diné self-determination. The 20th century also brought major changes in education. More Diné students attended schools. Some attended colleges and universities. A new generation of Diné professionals emerged. Teachers, lawyers, doctors, scientists, politicians, artists, writers. They were able to move between two worlds. They could understand American institutions while remaining connected to Diné identity. This became increasingly important as cultural preservation became a major concern. For generations, federal policies had attempted to weaken indigenous languages and traditions. But by the later 20th century, many Diné people were actively working to preserve them. Diné Bizad became an important symbol of cultural identity. Traditional ceremonies continued. Weaving continued. Silversmithing continued. Family and clan relationships remained important. And elders continued passing knowledge to younger generations. The struggle for cultural survival was no longer simply defensive. It was becoming a source of pride. The same language that had once been discouraged in schools had become internationally recognized because of the Code Talkers. The same traditions that officials had once called backward were being recognized as essential parts of Diné identity. The same homeland that outsiders had repeatedly attempted to control remained the center of Diné life. But the environmental problems continued. Uranium contamination became an especially painful legacy. The federal government eventually began acknowledging the seriousness of the problem. Cleanup programs were established. Some abandoned mines were sealed, contaminated structures were removed, water sources were tested, but cleanup was complicated. There were hundreds of abandoned uranium mine sites across the region. Some were remote, some were close to homes, some had been forgotten or poorly documented. The damage had accumulated over decades, and no single cleanup project could undo everything. For Diné communities, environmental protection became connected to sovereignty. Protecting water meant protecting families. Protecting land meant protecting culture. Protecting sacred places meant protecting identity. The old idea that land was simply a resource increasingly came into conflict with the Diné understanding of homeland. The modern Diné nation therefore faced a challenge that was both ancient and new. How could it preserve a way of life while participating in a modern economy? How could it create jobs without sacrificing the land? How could it maintain political independence while working with the United States? And how could it protect a language and culture after generations of assimilation pressure? There were no easy answers. But the Diné had faced difficult choices before. They had survived Spanish colonization. They had survived Mexican rule. They had survived American military campaigns. They had survived the Long Walk. They had survived Bosque Redondo. They had rebuilt after returning home. Now they were confronting the pressures of the modern world. And once again, they would adapt. But this time, they were not simply trying to survive. They were increasingly determined to shape their own future. The Diné had entered a new era. The old battles with armies had become part of history, but the struggle for the homeland had not ended. It had simply changed. Now the challenges were often found in government offices, courtrooms, schools, mines, and negotiations over land. The 20th century had shown the Diné that survival was not only about defending themselves from soldiers, it was also about protecting their ability to govern themselves. And slowly, a stronger political identity began to emerge. The Navajo Nation government developed through a complicated relationship with the United States. Federal officials wanted a government that could administer reservation affairs and communicate with Washington. Diné leaders wanted something more important. They wanted a political system that could represent their communities and defend their interests. This was not an easy process. The Navajo Nation covers an enormous area. Communities are spread across what are now Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Distances are great. Roads were limited for much of the 20th century. Different communities had different concerns. Some depended heavily on livestock. Others were closer to towns and trading centers. Some communities were deeply involved in traditional ceremonies. Others were increasingly connected to schools, wage employment, and American cities. Creating a unified political structure required bringing together people who lived across a huge homeland. Yet the need for representation became increasingly clear. Federal decisions were affecting nearly every part of Diné life. Land policies could change where families could graze livestock. Education policies could affect children. Mining policies could affect water. Federal agencies could influence economic development. The Diné needed a stronger voice. At the same time, a new generation was receiving more formal education. Some Diné students attended colleges far beyond the reservation. They studied law, medicine, education, engineering, government, and history. Many returned home. Others remained outside the reservation but continued working for Diné communities. This created a new kind of leadership, people who understood both American institutions and Diné traditions. They could speak to federal officials. They could understand legal documents. They could argue cases. They could negotiate contracts. And they could also understand why land and culture mattered so deeply to their communities. This combination became increasingly powerful. The Diné were no longer simply reacting to federal policy. They were learning how to shape it. One of the most important areas of this struggle was education. For generations, American schools had attempted to assimilate indigenous children. But by the later 20th century, many Diné people were demanding greater control over education. They wanted schools that respected their language. They wanted children to learn Diné history. They wanted cultural knowledge to be treated as something valuable rather than something that needed to disappear. This did not mean rejecting modern education. Many families wanted their children to learn mathematics, science, English, and other subjects needed to succeed in the modern economy. The goal was increasingly to create a balance. A child could learn the modern world without being forced to abandon the old one. Language became central to that effort. Diné Bizaad had survived generations of pressure, but survival did not mean security. English was becoming increasingly dominant. Television, radio, schools, workplaces, and popular culture all increased the influence of English. Some younger Diné people grew up speaking less Diné Bizaad than their grandparents. This created concern among elders and cultural leaders. If the language disappeared, a great deal of cultural knowledge could disappear with it. So, language preservation became an important part of cultural revitalization. Teachers developed programs, communities supported language instruction, families encouraged children to learn traditional expressions, and ceremonies continued to provide settings where the language remained alive. The same pattern appeared in traditional arts. Weaving continued. Diné silversmiths produced jewelry that became famous around the world. Artists combined traditional designs with new forms. Musicians and writers explored Diné identity through modern media. Culture was not frozen in the past. It was changing, and that was important. Cultural survival did not require every Diné person to live exactly as their ancestors had lived centuries earlier. It meant maintaining the ability to decide what should be preserved and what could change. That principle became increasingly important in politics. Sovereignty was not simply about controlling land, it was about having the authority to make decisions. The Navajo Nation developed its own government institutions. It established courts, it created laws, it managed programs, it negotiated economic agreements, it developed systems for education, health, infrastructure, and public services. The relationship with the United States remained complicated. Federal law still mattered. Congress still possessed enormous authority over tribal nations. But the Navajo Nation increasingly asserted its own governmental power. This was part of a broader movement among Native nations across the United States. During the 20th century, many indigenous communities began demanding greater self-determination. They challenged policies that had treated tribes as if they should eventually disappear into American society. They argued that tribal nations had survived and had rights that needed to be respected. The Diné were part of this larger movement. Their treaty remained important. The Treaty of 1868 was not simply a historical document. It remained a foundation for the relationship between the Navajo Nation and the United States. The treaty represented the end of the long walk. It represented the right to return home, and it became a basis for arguments about federal obligations. But treaties could be difficult to enforce. The United States government had often interpreted them according to its own interests. The Diné, therefore, had to defend their rights repeatedly, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through political pressure, sometimes through the courts, and sometimes through public campaigns. One of the most important modern struggles involved natural resources. Coal, uranium, oil, gas, and other resources beneath Diné lands attracted outside interest. The Navajo Nation could potentially earn revenue from development. Jobs could be created. Infrastructure could improve. But the environmental consequences could be severe. The debate over coal became particularly intense. Large coal deposits in the Four Corners region had powered American electricity generation for decades. Mining provided employment. Power plants provided energy. But mining also transformed landscapes. Water resources became a concern, and communities debated whether economic benefits justified environmental costs. There was no universal Diné position. Different people had different priorities. Some wanted jobs, some wanted environmental protection, some wanted both, and some believed that certain places should never be disturbed. These debates demonstrated something important about sovereignty. Having the power to make decisions also means having to make difficult decisions. There was no simple answer. The modern Navajo Nation had to balance economic development with cultural and environmental responsibility. That challenge continues. Meanwhile, the outside world was becoming increasingly aware of Diné history. The story of the Long Walk became more widely discussed. The contributions of the Code Talkers received greater recognition. Diné artists and writers brought their perspectives to national audiences. Museums and universities began giving greater attention to indigenous histories, and younger generations increasingly explored their own heritage. The old stereotypes were being challenged. The Diné were not simply people from a tragic chapter of frontier history. They were a living nation, a nation with its own government, its own language, its own communities, its own history, and its own future. The story that began among the sacred mountains had passed through centuries of enormous change. The Spanish had arrived. Mexico had taken control. The United States had expanded west. The Diné had been forced into exile. They had returned. Their children had been sent to distant schools. Their language had been discouraged. Their men had served in wars. Their land had been mined. And through all of it, they remained. That continuity may be one of the most remarkable aspects of Diné history. Empires changed, governments changed, technology changed, borders changed, but the people continued. And as the 20th century moved toward its final decades, a new generation began asking an old question: what does it mean to be Diné in a changing world? The answer would not be found by returning completely to the past, nor would it be found by abandoning the past. It would have to be created by the people themselves, and the foundation for that future had already been built in language, in family, in homeland, in sovereignty, and in memory. The story of the Diné had always been connected to the land. The mountains, the valleys, the rivers, the grazing lands, the fields of corn, and the sacred places that connected generations to one another. But as the 20th century progressed, the meaning of land became increasingly complicated. To the United States government, land could be measured, surveyed, divided, leased, mined, and developed. To the Diné, land was something much deeper. It was homeland. It was memory. It was identity. And protecting it became one of the most important responsibilities of the modern Navajo Nation. By the middle of the 20th century, the Navajo Nation was becoming increasingly involved in decisions about its own future. The old days of federal agents controlling nearly every aspect of reservation life were slowly changing. Diné leaders wanted greater authority. They wanted better schools, better roads, better health care, more economic opportunities, and greater control over natural resources. But achieving these goals required navigating the complicated relationship between tribal sovereignty and federal authority. The United States recognized tribal governments, but Congress still possessed enormous power over Native nations. This meant that the Navajo Nation could govern many matters internally while still depending on federal programs and facing federal restrictions. It was a difficult balance, and the Diné were learning how to operate within it. One of the most important changes was the growth of Navajo Nation government. The tribal government developed departments and institutions capable of handling increasingly complex responsibilities. Courts were established. Government programs expanded. Officials negotiated with federal agencies. Representatives traveled to Washington. And Diné leaders became increasingly experienced in defending treaty rights. The Treaty of 1868 remained at the center of many of these discussions. The treaty had been signed after the Long Walk. It had allowed the Diné to return home. And over the generations, it became more than a historical document. It became a symbol of sovereignty, a reminder that the Diné had not simply been granted a place to live. They had negotiated a political relationship with the United States. That distinction mattered because land disputes continued, resource development continued, and federal policies continued to change. The Diné therefore needed leaders who understood both worlds. They needed people who could speak the language of federal law while also understanding Diné traditions. Education became an important path toward producing those leaders. More Diné students entered high schools and universities. Some became lawyers, some became teachers, some became doctors, some became engineers, some entered government, others became artists, writers, historians, and cultural educators. They carried their identity with them, and many returned home with knowledge that could strengthen their communities. This was a major transformation. For generations, education had often been used as a tool of assimilation. Now, Diné people were increasingly using education as a tool of self-determination. They were learning the systems that had once been imposed upon them and using that knowledge to defend themselves. At the same time, cultural education became increasingly important. Parents and elders wanted younger generations to understand their history, not only the history written in American textbooks, but the history remembered within Diné families, the Long Walk, the Treaty of 1868, the Code Talkers, the stories of individual clans, the teachings associated with the Homeland, the knowledge of plants and animals, the skills of weaving and silversmithing, and the Diné language. Diné remained at the heart of cultural identity, but its future was not guaranteed. English had become dominant in many schools and workplaces. Young people were increasingly exposed to American popular culture. Some families moved away from the reservation for work. Cities drew younger generations, and as elders age, there was concern that traditional knowledge might disappear with them. Language preservation therefore became an increasingly important goal. Some schools introduced Diné language programs. Communities supported cultural education. Families encouraged children to speak the language. And elders continued teaching. The goal was not simply to preserve words, it was to preserve a way of understanding the world. A language carries concepts that may not have exact translations. It contains ways of describing relationships, places, family, responsibility, and harmony. When a language survives, more than vocabulary survives. A worldview survives. This became particularly meaningful in a rapidly changing modern world. Technology was transforming everyday life. Television reached reservation communities. Cars made travel easier. Phones connected distant communities. Eventually, computers and the internet would connect the Navajo Nation to the rest of the world. But modernization did not automatically mean abandoning tradition. Diné people adapted technology to their own purposes. Modern homes could exist beside traditional practices. A person could work in a government office during the day and participate in a ceremony with family later. A young person could study at a university and still remain connected to their clan. A Diné artist could use modern materials while drawing upon traditional designs. Culture was not frozen, it was evolving. And perhaps that was one of the greatest lessons of Diné history. The people had survived by adapting without completely surrendering their identity. They had adopted sheep. They had learned to ride horses. They had traded with Europeans. They had navigated Mexican rule. They had survived American military campaigns. They had entered schools. They had served in the U.S. military. They had participated in modern industries. Yet they continued to call themselves Diné. This ability to adapt became especially important as economic development accelerated. The Navajo Nation possessed valuable natural resources. Coal was important. Oil and gas existed in some areas. Uranium had already left a painful legacy. Renewable energy would eventually become another possibility. But every economic opportunity raised difficult questions. Would development create jobs? Would it damage water? Would it disturb sacred places? Would profits remain within the community? Would future generations inherit a healthy landscape? These questions could not be answered simply by looking at financial numbers. For the Diné, the value of land could not always be measured in dollars. A mountain could have spiritual significance. A spring could be essential to a community. A grazing area could support generations of families. A landscape could contain stories. Economic development, therefore, became a conversation about sovereignty. Who should decide, and whose definition of progress should matter? These questions remain relevant today. The Navajo Nation has continued pursuing economic development in areas ranging from tourism and agriculture to energy, arts, and small businesses. But the nation has also faced serious challenges. Poverty has remained a concern in many communities. Infrastructure can be limited. Some remote areas have historically lacked reliable access to electricity, running water, paved roads, and other services. Healthcare access can be difficult because of the enormous size of the reservation. These challenges are part of the modern story. but they do not define the entire story. There is another side. There are thriving communities. There are schools teaching Diné culture. There are artists creating new work. There are young people learning the language. There are families maintaining ceremonies. There are entrepreneurs building businesses. There are leaders defending sovereignty. And there are elders continuing to pass knowledge forward. The Diné story, therefore, remains unfinished. It is not a story that ended with the Long Walk. It did not end with the Treaty of 1868. It did not end with the boarding schools. It did not end with World War II. And it did not end with the uranium mines. Each generation has inherited the challenges of the previous one and added something of its own. Perhaps that is why the long history of the Diné is best understood not as a story of survival alone. It is a story of continuity. A people were forced from their homeland, yet returned. A language was discouraged, yet survived. A government was weakened, yet rebuilt. A culture was attacked, yet continued. A homeland was threatened, yet remained central to identity. And through every transformation northward, the mountains remained on the horizon. The four sacred peaks continued to define a world. The old stories continued to be remembered. The clans continued to connect families. And the people continued moving forward. The future would bring new challenges: technology, climate change, economic pressure, water scarcity, political disputes, environmental cleanup, and the continuing struggle to protect language and culture. But the Diné had already learned something over centuries of history. The future does not have to mean forgetting the past. It can mean carrying the past forward and allowing it to become part of something new. By the beginning of the 21st century, the Diné were carrying a history that stretched across centuries. Their ancestors had lived among the mountains and deserts of the Southwest. They had adapted to new animals. They had traded with neighboring peoples. They had faced Spanish soldiers. They had lived under Mexican rule. They had fought American troops. They had endured the long walk. They had survived Bosque Redondo. They had returned home, and they had spent generations rebuilding. But history had left scars. Some were visible, others were carried quietly within families. The memory of forced removal remained. So did the memory of children taken to boarding schools. So did the memory of land lost. And so did the memory of workers who had entered uranium mines believing they were simply taking jobs, only to discover years later that the work had exposed them and their families to serious danger. Yet alongside these memories was something else: pride. The Diné had not disappeared. They had continued. And in the modern era, many began placing renewed emphasis on preserving their language, traditions, and relationship with the homeland. One of the most important parts of this effort was education. For much of the previous century, education had often been used to separate Indigenous children from their cultures. Now, Diné communities increasingly sought to make education a place where culture could survive. Schools began incorporating Diné history and language. Students learned about their clans. They learned about the Treaty of 1868. They learned about the Long Walk. They learned about the Code Talkers. They learned about traditional arts. And they learned that being Diné and participating in the modern world did not have to be contradictory. A young person could learn mathematics and Diné history. They could study engineering while learning traditional teachings from grandparents. They could use a computer while speaking Diné Bizad at home. They could attend a university far from the reservation and still remain connected to their homeland. This ability to combine old knowledge with new opportunities became one of the defining features of modern Diné life. Language remained especially important. Diné Bizad had survived extraordinary pressure, but survival was not guaranteed. Many older speakers worried about younger generations losing fluency, so language programs expanded. Teachers developed new materials. Families encouraged children to speak. Radio programs used the language. Cultural organizations worked to preserve traditional vocabulary and expressions. The goal was not simply to keep a language alive for historical reasons. The language remained connected to identity. It carried ways of describing relationships, places, responsibilities, and the natural world. For many Diné people, speaking the language was part of knowing who they were. Traditional arts also became an important form of continuity. Diné weaving remained famous. The designs evolved over time, but the knowledge of spinning, dyeing, and weaving continued. Silversmithing became another important art form. Jewelry incorporating turquoise and silver became associated with Diné craftsmanship. But these arts were more than commercial products. They represented skills passed between generations. An elder could teach a young person. A mother could teach a daughter. A family could maintain a technique that had been used for decades. And a young artist could take that tradition in a new direction. This was cultural survival through creativity. The same principle appeared in music and storytelling. Modern Diné musicians created new forms while drawing on traditional sounds and themes. Writers told stories from Diné perspectives. Artists painted landscapes that connected modern life with ancient homeland. Filmmakers and historians explored subjects that had often been described only through the eyes of outsiders. The Diné were increasingly telling their own story. That mattered. For much of American history, native peoples had often been described by explorers, soldiers, missionaries, government officials, and journalists. Their own voices were not always given equal attention. Modern Diné scholars and writers began changing that. They examined the past through Diné perspectives. They revisited the Long Walk. They examined the treaty. They documented boarding school experiences. They recorded oral histories. They preserved family stories. And they challenged simplified versions of history. The result was a fuller picture. The Diné were not simply passive victims of American expansion. They had made choices. They had negotiated. They had resisted. They had adapted. They had rebuilt. And they had created political institutions of their own. Sovereignty, therefore, remained a central issue. The Navajo Nation was not simply a cultural community. It was a political nation. Its government had responsibilities to its citizens. It operated courts. It managed programs. It negotiated with federal and state governments. It addressed economic development. It dealt with infrastructure. And it defended the nation's interest. But sovereignty did not mean complete independence from the United States. The relationship remained complicated. Federal laws continued to affect tribal authority. Congress retained significant power over tribal nations. Federal agencies continued to operate on or around the reservation, and many services depended upon cooperation between tribal and federal governments. The Navajo Nation therefore had to constantly defend its political authority while working within a larger American system. This was particularly important when dealing with natural resources. The history of uranium mining had taught painful lessons. Economic development could bring jobs, but it could also leave long-term environmental damage. The same questions appeared with coal and other resources. What should be developed? What should remain untouched? Who should receive the economic benefits? How should water be protected? How should sacred places be protected? And what responsibilities did the present generation have to future generations? These were not abstract questions. They affected real communities. They affected grazing areas. They affected water sources. They affected family lands, and they affected the health of people living near development sites. Water became especially important. The Southwest is naturally dry. Climate variability can make water difficult to obtain. Many remote communities have historically faced limited access to reliable water infrastructure. For families living in these areas, water is not simply an environmental issue, it is a daily necessity. The struggle for water therefore became connected to both economic development and sovereignty. Who controls the water? Who has access? Who pays for infrastructure? Who decides how resources are used? These questions continue to shape the modern Navajo Nation. And yet, even with these challenges, there has been enormous progress. Modern Diné communities have schools, colleges, businesses, hospitals, government offices, artists, entrepreneurs, scientists, and political leaders. Young people travel beyond the reservation and return with new ideas. Others remain in their communities and build careers there. Some work in technology, some in education, some in agriculture, some in government. Some continue family traditions of weaving and silversmithing. There is no single way to be Diné. The modern nation contains many experiences, urban and rural, traditional and contemporary, young and old, English-speaking and Diné-speaking, yet all remain connected through a shared history. And that history reaches back much farther than the United States. The Diné were here before modern borders. They were here before American states. They were here before railroads. They were here before highways. Their relationship with the Southwest existed long before the political map looked anything like it does today. That is why the homeland remains so important. The land is not merely where the story happened. It is part of the story. The mountains hold memory. The canyons hold memory. The trails hold memory. The fields hold memory. And the people carry that memory forward. Perhaps this is one of the clearest lessons of the long history of the Diné. A people can experience enormous disruption without losing their identity. They can be forced away and still return. Their language can be suppressed and still survive. Their children can be separated and still reconnect. Their economy can be damaged and still be rebuilt. Their political authority can be challenged and still grow stronger. History does not erase people simply because it is powerful. Sometimes people reshape history themselves, and the Diné have been doing exactly that for generations. Their story is still unfolding. There are still debates over land. There are still environmental problems. There are still challenges involving language preservation. There are still questions about economic development. There are still young people deciding how they will carry their heritage into the future. But they are not starting from nothing. They are building upon centuries of memory. And as another generation grows up beneath the four sacred mountains, the long story continues. The story of the Diné is not only a story of survival, it is also a story of service. Throughout the 20th century, Diné men and women entered a rapidly changing American society, working in farms, mines, schools, businesses, and government. Some traveled far from the reservation. Others remained close to home. And many carried with them a strong connection to their families, their language, and their homeland. Perhaps nowhere was this more visible than in the story of the Navajo Code Talkers. During the Second World War, the United States needed secure military communications. The Pacific battlefield was enormous. American forces were spread across islands, beaches, jungles, and naval bases. Radio communication was essential, but radio messages could be intercepted. The United States therefore needed a way to communicate quickly without allowing the enemy to understand the messages. Diné Bizad provided an unusual solution. The language was unfamiliar to the Japanese military. It had a complex structure, and when combined with a specially developed military code, it became extremely difficult for outsiders to understand. Diné men were recruited into the Marine Corps. They trained as radio operators. They memorized code words. They practiced transmitting messages rapidly. And then they went to war. They served in some of the most dangerous campaigns of the Pacific. They transmitted messages during battles. They coordinated movements. They reported positions. They communicated orders. And they helped keep American units connected when communication could mean the difference between success and disaster. Their contribution was remarkable. But there was an extraordinary irony behind it. For decades, American education policies had attempted to suppress indigenous languages. Children in boarding schools had sometimes been punished for speaking their own languages. Yet during World War II, the United States military depended upon Diné, a language that officials had once treated as an obstacle to assimilation, had become a military advantage. The Code Talkers demonstrated something powerful. Their language had survived, and it could serve the modern world without losing its identity. The men who served were not simply symbols. They were individuals. They had families. They had communities. They had different reasons for joining the military. Some were very young. Some were motivated by patriotism. Some wanted adventure. Some wanted employment. Some felt a responsibility to serve, whatever their reasons. They entered a world far beyond the reservation. They traveled across oceans. They encountered cultures they had never seen, and many experienced combat for the first time. The Pacific War was brutal. Battles were fought across tropical islands. Heat and humidity were exhausting. Disease was a constant threat. Artillery and aircraft filled the sky, and soldiers could disappear from one moment to the next. The Code Talkers were exposed to these dangers alongside everyone else. Their work was not performed safely behind a distant desk. They were often close to the fighting. They had to communicate under pressure, and they had to remain calm while the battlefield around them was chaotic. Some Code Talkers were wounded. Some were killed. Others returned home carrying memories they rarely discussed. Because their work was classified, many people did not understand what they had accomplished. For decades, the full story remained largely hidden. The Code Talkers therefore returned to a country that celebrated victory without fully recognizing their contribution. Many simply returned to ordinary life. They raised families. They worked. They farmed. They became community leaders. Some continued serving in the military. Others became involved in education and politics, and gradually, the story began to emerge. As secrecy restrictions were lifted, the importance of the Code Talkers became more widely known. Recognition followed. The United States honored surviving Code Talkers. The story entered textbooks and museums. The public began to understand that Diné language had played an important role in the Allied victory in the Pacific. But the story of Diné military service extends beyond World War II. Diné people have served in later American conflicts as well. Military service became one of many ways that Diné citizens participated in the wider United States while maintaining a distinct tribal identity. This dual identity is important. Being Diné did not mean being disconnected from America. The Diné had their own nation and homeland, but their people were also citizens of the United States. They could serve in the American military while remaining connected to their tribal community. They could participate in American politics while defending tribal sovereignty. They could use English while preserving Diné Bizad. They could attend American universities while learning from traditional elders. These overlapping identities became part of modern Diné life. But while the Code Talkers were earning recognition, other Diné communities were confronting another legacy of American policy: uranium mining. During and after World War II, the United States needed enormous quantities of uranium for the nuclear weapons program. Mining companies entered the Southwest. Diné workers were recruited. For families facing poverty and limited employment opportunities, mining jobs could seem attractive. The wages could provide important income, but many workers were not properly informed about the dangers of radiation. The mines were often poorly ventilated. Workers could breathe radioactive dust. Protective equipment was inadequate, and waste materials were sometimes left near communities. The consequences unfolded slowly. Years passed, then decades. People became sick, families lost relatives, communities began recognizing patterns of illness, and eventually, the connection between uranium mining and health problems became impossible to ignore. The tragedy was made worse because many workers had not been given adequate warnings. They had been contributing to one of the most important technological projects in American history, while facing dangers they did not fully understand. The mines also left environmental problems. Some abandoned mine sites remained on or near Diné lands. Contaminated water became a concern. Waste rock remained in the landscape, and families sometimes lived near places that had once been active mines. The story of uranium became another example of the complicated relationship between economic opportunity and environmental protection. The Diné needed jobs, but they also needed healthy communities. They needed development, but they needed clean water. They needed access to the national economy, but they also needed control over what happened on their homeland. These tensions continue into the present. The legacy of uranium mining helped strengthen environmental activism within Diné communities. Residents, health advocates, scientists, and tribal officials pushed for cleanup and greater protection. They demanded that abandoned mines be identified. They demanded that contaminated water be addressed. And they demanded recognition for workers and families who had suffered. This was another form of resistance, not resistance with rifles, but resistance through organization, law, science, and political action. The Diné had learned that sovereignty required more than simply possessing a reservation. It required having a voice in decisions affecting the land. It required defending water. It required protecting communities. It required educating younger generations. And it required remembering the lessons of the past. The Code Talkers represented one side of modern Diné history. They demonstrated how Diné culture could contribute to the wider world. The uranium legacy represented another. It showed the dangers that could arise when outside interests entered indigenous lands without sufficient protection for the people who live there. Together, these stories reveal the complexity of the modern Diné experience. There was pride, there was sacrifice, there was opportunity, there was injustice, there was adaptation, and there was determination. The Diné were no longer living in the 19th century world of the Long Walk. They were part of a modern nation. They were building governments, educating children, operating businesses, serving in the military, creating art, protecting language, and defending their homeland. The long history continued to move forward. And perhaps the most important lesson was becoming clearer. The Diné did not survive by remaining unchanged. They survived by adapting, while deciding for themselves what could never be surrendered. The story of the Diné has always been a story of homeland. Long before modern borders were drawn across the Southwest, the people had developed relationships with mountains, rivers, fields, grazing lands, and sacred places. And in the modern era, protecting that homeland became one of the greatest challenges facing the Navajo Nation. The reservation was enormous. It stretched across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, but size alone did not guarantee security. The Diné still had to defend their land from outside pressures. Some pressures came from government policy, others came from mining, some came from economic hardship, and others came from the changing climate of the Southwest. Water became increasingly important. The region was already naturally dry. Rainfall could be unpredictable, drought could damage crops and grazing lands. Communities far from major towns could face serious difficulties obtaining reliable water. For many families, this was not simply an environmental problem, it was a question of daily life. Water meant livestock. Water meant agriculture. Water meant health. Water meant community. And water was part of the homeland itself. As the modern Navajo Nation developed, leaders increasingly recognized that economic development and environmental protection could not be separated. Jobs were needed, infrastructure was needed, businesses were needed, young people needed opportunities. But development that damaged land or water could create problems that lasted for generations. This tension became particularly visible in debates over energy. For decades, coal had played an important role in the economy of the Four Corners region. Coal mines provided employment, power plants produced electricity for communities far beyond Diné, and agreements involving tribal resources could provide revenue for the Navajo Nation, but coal mining also changed landscapes. Land was disturbed, water resources became a concern, and communities debated whether the economic benefits justified the environmental costs. There was no single answer shared by everyone. Some people wanted jobs, some wanted stronger environmental protections. Some believed that the nation needed economic independence. Others argued that certain landscapes were too important to sacrifice. These disagreements were not signs of weakness. They were evidence of a nation making its own decisions. Sovereignty means having the ability to make difficult choices. And the Navajo Nation increasingly asserted that decisions about Diné lands should involve Diné people. This principle extended beyond mining. It applied to grazing, tourism, energy, education, water, infrastructure, and cultural resources. The question was always the same: who gets to decide what happens on the homeland? That question had existed since the 19th century, but now, the Diné had more political tools with which to answer it. The Navajo Nation government became increasingly sophisticated. Departments handled different areas of public life. Courts addressed legal disputes. Elected officials represented communities. Government programs provided services. And tribal leaders negotiated with state and federal authorities. The nation was not simply waiting for Washington to decide its future. It was participating in those decisions. At the same time, Diné communities were experiencing a cultural revival. Traditional knowledge was being valued in new ways. Elders were recognized as important sources of history. Language programs were established. Cultural centers preserved traditional knowledge. Museums and educational programs shared Diné history, and younger people increasingly explored their heritage. The internet created new possibilities. A person living far from the reservation could access Diné language resources. Families could record elders telling stories. Artists could reach audiences around the world. Students could study Diné history through digital resources. Technology, once seen simply as a symbol of outside culture, could now be used to strengthen cultural connections. This was another example of adaptation. The Diné were not rejecting modern technology, they were deciding how to use it. The same pattern appeared in the arts. Diné artists created paintings, jewelry, textiles, photography, film, and music. Some worked closely with traditional forms. Others experimented with completely modern styles, but both could express Diné identity. A traditional weaving could carry generations of knowledge. A modern painting could explore the experience of growing up between cultures. A song could combine contemporary music with Diné language. Culture was not a museum object. It was alive, and living cultures change. This was especially important for younger generations. A young Diné person might grow up watching American television. They might use social media. They might attend a university. They might work in a city, and yet They could still know their clan, still speak Diné Bizad, still return home for family gatherings, still participate in ceremonies, still recognize the four sacred mountains. Identity did not have to fit into a single category. The modern Diné experience could contain many worlds at once, but serious challenges remained. Economic inequality continued to affect many communities. Some areas lacked infrastructure that most Americans take for granted. Remote communities could have limited access to health care. Roads could be difficult to travel. Reliable electricity and running water were not always available everywhere. These challenges were reminders that the story of the Navajo Nation was not simply one of historical triumph. Progress existed alongside inequality, and sovereignty did not eliminate the need for resources. The Navajo Nation continued working to strengthen its economy. Tourism became one area of interest. Visitors came to see the dramatic landscapes of Diné Bikéyah. Places such as Canyon de Chelly became internationally recognized. Monument Valley, while shared across political boundaries, became another symbol strongly associated with the Southwest. Tourism could bring revenue, but it also raised questions. How should sacred and culturally important places be presented? How should visitors behave? Who should control tourism? How can communities benefit without turning their homeland into a spectacle? Again, the answer required balance, the same balance that had shaped Diné life for generations. Economic opportunity had to exist alongside cultural responsibility. The environmental legacy of uranium mining remained another major concern. Cleanup efforts continued. Contaminated sites were investigated. Water sources were monitored. Families affected by uranium exposure continued seeking recognition and assistance. The work was slow. Some mines had been abandoned for decades, some locations were difficult to reach, and the damage could not simply be erased, but bringing attention to the problem was itself a form of change. The Diné were no longer silent participants in decisions about their land. They were demanding answers. They were working with scientists. They were organizing communities. They were using legal and political systems. They were telling their own stories. And they were insisting that development could not come at any cost. This growing confidence was connected to something much older: memory. The long walk had taught generations that losing control of the homeland could have devastating consequences. The Treaty of 1868 had demonstrated the importance of written agreements. Boarding schools had shown the dangers of cultural assimilation. Uranium mining had demonstrated the long-term consequences of resource extraction. The Code Talkers had shown the strength of Diné language. Each chapter had left a lesson, and those lessons were shaping the future. The Navajo Nation entered the 21st century carrying all of them. The people were not living in the same world as their ancestors, but they were still connected to them. The sacred mountains remained, the clans remained, the language remained, the ceremonies remained, the homeland remained, and the political nation remained. The long history of the Diné, therefore, cannot be reduced to a story of suffering. It is also a story of rebuilding, a story of adaptation, a story of political growth, a story of cultural survival, and a story of people deciding generation after generation what kind of future they wanted. There were still difficult questions ahead. Climate change could intensify drought. Water resources could become more valuable. Economic development would continue to create difficult choices. Language preservation would require continued effort. Young people would continue moving between the reservation and the wider world, and the relationship between the Navajo Nation and the United States would continue evolving. But the Diné were not beginning this future empty-handed. They carried centuries of knowledge. They carried the memory of the homeland. They carried the lessons of Weldi, and they carried the voices of generations who had refused to disappear. The story that began long ago among the sacred mountains was still being written, and perhaps that is the most remarkable part of all. The history of the Diné is not finished. It is alive, in the language spoken by a child, in the hands of a weaver, in the stories told by an elder, in the decisions made by a tribal leader, in the fields where corn is planted, in the sheep grazing beneath the mesas, and in every generation that looks toward the four sacred mountains and remembers where home is. The long history of the Diné does not end with a treaty. It does not end with the long walk. It does not end with the return home. And it does not end with the arrival of modern America. Because the story of a people is never contained in a single century. It continues through children, through families, through language, through memory, and through the land itself. For the Diné, that land remains at the center of everything. The four sacred mountains still mark the boundaries of the homeland. The mesas still rise above the desert. The canyons still carry water. The fields still produce corn. Sheep still graze across the high country. And families still gather beneath the same enormous skies that their ancestors knew. The world around them has changed dramatically, but the relationship with the homeland has endured. That continuity is perhaps the greatest theme in the long history of the Navajo people. Generations ago, the Diné lived in a Southwest filled with other indigenous nations. They farmed, they hunted, they gathered, they traded, they moved across the landscape. They developed traditions and social systems that connected families across enormous distances. Then came the Spanish. New animals arrived. New religions arrived. New forms of political power arrived. The Diné adapted. They learned to work with sheep. They became skilled horsemen. They traded. They fought. They negotiated. They survived. Then Mexico replaced Spain. The political map changed again. The Diné continued. Then the United States expanded into the Southwest. The pressure became greater. Treaties were signed. Peace was promised. Conflict returned. And eventually, the Diné were forced from their homeland. The long walk became one of the darkest chapters in their history. Thousands were taken toward Hueldi. Families suffered hunger, disease, separation, and death. At Bosque Redondo, the experiment of forced relocation failed, but the Diné endured. They remembered home. And in 1868, they returned. The Treaty of 1868 gave them a foundation for rebuilding. They planted again. They raised sheep. They rebuilt communities. They continued ceremonies. They continued speaking their language. They taught their children. They rebuilt their nation. But the pressures did not disappear. Boarding schools attempted to reshape Diné children. Federal policies interfered with land and livestock. Economic development brought opportunities and dangers. Uranium mining left a painful environmental legacy. Coal and other resources created difficult debates. And through all of these changes, the Diné continued adapting. Perhaps adaptation is one of the clearest threads running through their history. The Diné did not survive by refusing every change. They survived by deciding which changes they could use and which things they could not afford to lose. Sheep became part of Diné life. Horses became part of Diné life. Wool became art. Trading became part of the economy. Modern education became a tool. The English language became useful. Technology became useful. Political institutions became necessary. But beneath these changes, the deeper foundations remained: family, clan, language, ceremony, homeland, memory. These were the things that could not simply be replaced. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers offers a powerful example. Diné Bizad had once been discouraged by American schools. Children had sometimes been punished for speaking it. Yet during World War II, the United States military depended upon that language. Young Diné men carried it across the Pacific. They used it to transmit messages during some of the most important battles of the war. Their language became part of American military history. The Code Talkers demonstrated something that had been true for generations. Culture can survive pressure. A language can survive attempts to silence it. A tradition can survive attempts to replace it. But survival requires people willing to carry those things forward. That responsibility belongs to every generation. And today, young Diné people are carrying that responsibility in new ways. Some are learning Diné Bizad, some are studying traditional teachings, some are becoming teachers, some are becoming doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists, scientists, and political leaders. Some are building businesses, some are working to protect water, some are restoring traditional foods, some are documenting the stories of their grandparents. Others are creating music, films, paintings, and literature that speak to modern Diné life. They are not simply preserving the past, they are creating the future. And that distinction matters. Culture does not remain alive by standing still. It remains alive because people use it, speak it, teach it, create with it, question it, adapt it, and pass it onward. The Navajo Nation today is therefore not a relic of the past. It is a living nation. It has its own government, its own institutions, its own communities, its own political debates, its own cultural movements, its own challenges, and its own hopes. The relationship with the United States remains complicated. Treaty obligations remain important. Questions about land, water, resources, and federal authority continue. The nation still has to balance economic development with environmental protection. It still has to address infrastructure challenges. It still has to protect cultural resources. And it still has to find ways to ensure that younger generations have opportunities without being forced to leave their homeland. These challenges are serious, but they are not new. The Diné have faced difficult choices for centuries, and history has repeatedly shown that they possess an extraordinary ability to endure. There's another lesson hidden within this long story. The history of the Diné cannot be understood only through the actions of governments. It must also be understood through ordinary people, the farmer planting corn, the shepherd watching over a flock, the grandmother teaching a child a word in Diné Bizad, the weaver sitting at her loom, the silversmith shaping a piece of jewelry, the elder telling a family story, the young person returning home after years away. These people carry history. They are the connection between generations. A treaty can be written on paper. A government can create laws. A military can conquer territory. But none of those things can fully determine what a people remembers. Memory belongs to the people. And the Diné have remembered. They remember the homeland. They remember Hueldi. They remember the long walk. They remember the return. They remember the Code Talkers. They remember the children who went away to boarding schools. They remember the miners who became sick. They remember the struggles over land and water. But they also remember the celebrations, the songs, the ceremonies, the harvests, the family gatherings, the moments of laughter, the beauty of the mountains, the colors of the desert, the sound of sheep moving across the landscape. History contains pain, but it also contains life. And that may be the most important thing to understand. The story of the Navajo people is not simply a story about what happened to them. It is a story about what they did afterward. They rebuilt, they adapted, they organized, they negotiated, they created, they remembered, they endured, and they continued. So when we look across Diné Bikéyah today, we are not looking at the remains of an ancient people. We are looking at a living homeland, a living culture, a living nation. The mountains that once guided generations still stand. The language is still spoken. The ceremonies continue, the clans continue to connect families. The art continues to evolve, the government continues to develop, and children continue to grow beneath the same wide southwestern sky. The long history continues. Perhaps that is where we should leave our journey, not with the sound of a battle, not with the closing of a treaty, not with the footsteps of people leaving their homeland, but with the quiet image of home. The Navajo landscape at sunset, the mesas glowing in the distance, a small field of corn moving gently in the evening wind, sheep grazing beyond a family home, an elder speaking softly to a child, and somewhere beyond them, the sacred mountains standing against the sky. Generations have come and gone beneath those mountains. Empires have risen and disappeared. Borders have moved. Governments have changed. Technologies have transformed the world. But the Diné remain. Their history is still being written. And perhaps the greatest lesson of that history is simple. A people can be wounded without being erased. A homeland can be threatened without being forgotten. A language can be suppressed without being silenced forever. And a journey that begins with exile can eventually lead home. The story of the Diné is therefore not a story of an ending. It is a story of continuity, a story carried from generation to generation, from elder to child, from mountain to valley, from memory to memory. And as long as those stories continue to be told, the long history of the Navajo people will continue, quietly, patiently, and beneath the endless southwestern sky.